Hi everyone, today we get to talk about the birthplace of Chinese steel sabers. This is a beautiful sword that was sent to me by LK Chen for review. It's called the Infantry Han Dao, and it's a type of ring pommel single-edged sword. So we're going to be talking about Dao, and just to go over it from the beginning, there's basically all of Chinese arms can be split into two camps, either a Qian, which is a straight double-edged sword, or a Dao, which has a single edge. Now, we think of most Dao as being curved like sabers, and that does happen in later Chinese history. We really start to see that occurring with the influence of the Turkic tribes. Once we see the Liao and the Khitan dynasties starting around the time of the Song dynasty, you start to see curved blades, and it really starts to kick off following the Mongol conquest. So with those influences, Han Chinese swords start to incorporate those designs. Prior to that, most Chinese designs are much more straight. So a blade like this, even though it's pretty straight, and we're going to talk about that as we get a closer look at it, is still called a Dao because it is single-edged. It is not double-edged like all the Qian we were looking at earlier. So, what is this and where does it come from? This design comes from roughly the Han Dynasty. These start showing up around 100 BC or so. This is made of steel, but there are earlier Bronze Age designs. And again, remember the Han Dynasty, which follows the Qin Dynasty, is kind of the transition from bronze weapons, especially swords, into steel. So Han centralized a lot of things. The government took over the manufacturing and was able to make large-scale production of iron and steel weapons. So even though bronze continued for certain aspects, for instance, things like crossbow quirls, the arrowheads, things like very small, kind of disposable items continued to be made out of bronze. Larger things like halberds, axes, swords seem to start being made out of steel by the time of the Han Dynasty. So, in the Han Dynasty, influences were happening from the outside. The big baddies were, surprise, surprise, the nomadic tribes, mostly to the north and west, the Xiongnu. They had swords very similar to this. They were, again, a horse-faring people that would move around and not stay in one place. And these type of swords may or may not have had a kind of cavalry sort of component. The debate is still out there as to if the popularity of these swords from the horsemen that the Han Chinese came up against caused their incorporation, as the tactics had to be used against these sort of nomadic tribes, because we do have earlier types of short dao, short knives, that have this kind of form in China. My buddy Scholar General Keith has a good video talking about the early types of these ring pommel dao and what the ring means and could have been used for. I really suggest you check that out. So the origin of them is a little obscured. What is known, though, is while in the earlier kind of Bronze Age and Warring State period through the unification under the Qin, the weapon of war had been a shield and a jian. During the Han Dynasty, so from maybe 100 BC through to about 180 or so, a transition was made in the general infantry, going from a qian to a dao, not unlike this. So this became the standard infantry saber. And in many ways, you could think of this not unlike a Roman gladius, which was, again, a contemporary weapon, because remember, the Han Dynasty is occurring around the same time as the Roman Empire is occurring in Europe. So this weapon, which is, what do we have? My little tape measure here, it is 60 centimeters in length, or about 23.5 inches in blade length, is very similar in size to a gladius and would have been used in a shield in large unit formation. So something to consider, that at the same time that Romans were using very large organized armies, the same thing was going on in China. However, the big difference is we have a single edge instead of a double edge. So let's take a quick look at the stats. So those are the dynamics of it. And compared to later swords, a couple things stand out. For instance, the pivot points are very close together on it. The other thing is it has a lot of movement that's going on here in the hilt. There's a couple reasons for that. One is it's a very light sword. Overall, the sword comes in at only a little less than 500 grams, 480 grams. So the absolute mass of the sword is very light. The other thing is that it has very little mass here in the hilt. So the hilt is constructed, the body of the sword comes back straight into the position for the ring pommel to attach. So the tang, kind of like a Japanese sword, is exactly the same width as the spine of the guard, and it just continues in the same size all the way to the back. Then it has a slab scale construction for the hilt. It has two pieces of wood, and then it's cord wrapped. And as a result, there's not a lot of weight here, so you have a sword that is it's able to maneuver very fast from here, and it carries an unusual proportion of its weight out in the blade, which is necessary because otherwise at 500 grams you'd have very little ability to give cuts. Even so, it's a very fast blade. So this is something, if you're new to swords and you want to start with a fun cutter, but perhaps you haven't worked out and you're going to get tired quickly by swinging around a big heavy sword, this is a good starter's sword to get to know. Let's talk about the nitty-gritty features for a second. So the sword obviously has just a simple ring pommel that's been attached by forge welding, I believe. It then, as I mentioned, has two slab scales of wood that are, I believe, glued in place. And then it has this very intricate cord wrap here for the grip that's made of rayon, which is kind of almost like a paracord style of wrap. It's a little complicated, the wrapping technique. We do have some existing grips from tomb finds that show how this wrap is done, and this is pretty consistent. So with historical finds, this is entirely consistent. LK Chen has done a very faithful job replicating how the swords were historically made, and you can see what is kind of unique about it is it just has a simple, it's not even a cross guard, it's kind of like a ferrule that's here, and that's to lock it into position. So you can see, we slide it into the scabbard, and it makes a pretty decent fit here. And the retention is quite good. It's not going to come out at all. Taking a moment to look over the scabbard. The scabbard is wood with a clamshell construction. There's a very small seam on it, and it has a simple rounded brass scabbard slide. These are all cast bronze fittings that, or brass, it's a brassy bronze, is kind of lighter color than traditional bronze that we have here. As a quick point of reference, if you're picking up one of these, LK Chen has done something that very few manufacturers have done. For several models of his sword, including these Han Dao, he has gone back and reiterated on his original designs. There's a couple of reasons he's done that. So we're looking at two swords today. The first one that we're looking at is the shorter Infantry Dao, and in a second I'm going to pull over the longer Cavalry Dao. Now, these are just two Dao, and to show you a comparison, So these are just two different size Dao, and you can see that they're very different lengths. Now, it's worth noting that we have thousands upon thousands of surviving examples of swords from the Han Dynasty. And LK Chen has been very, very faithful about making sure that these are representatives of original finds. And even though this infantry example is quite a bit shorter than the larger cavalry example, these are just two of a whole myriad of examples of different sizes, different shapes that exist in the archaeological record. So whereas there's a short one and a long one, in fact, we have ones that range in size from this all the way to this size and beyond. There are examples that are quite a bit bigger than this. There are examples that are large two-handed examples of Dao from the Han Dynasty, and we have examples that are much smaller than this, that are very, very short and ornate and with gilded design elements and dragons and all sorts of things that would fit in a nobleman's robes quite nicely. And so with that kind of in mind, LK Chen has taken it upon himself to revisit some of his designs and improve his original swords to make new versions based on things that he liked and things that he thought could be improved upon using and different antiques or improving based on manufacturing standards. So this particular Infantry Dao is kind of like the version 1 model. If you purchase it now directly from him, you would be probably ordering the version 2 models, which will have some minor differences that we can talk about. So, for example, this has a beautiful blade, and on first glance, it will look straight backed. However, if we put my handy ruler next to it, you'll see that it has a very gradual curve down towards the edge of the blade. In the newer versions, the blade is even more pronounced and curved. And again, in the original finds, the original archaeological finds, there's a whole spectrum of them. The first version seemed to come from a particularly straight blade, and the newer versions he's working from come from slightly more curved blades. It does have distal taper. It starts from a modestly thick spine, and it tapers down over the length of the blade. And to the camera, if we're looking at it, it will have a kind of long, thin machete sort of profile with this kind of hatchet tip towards the end. Very interestingly, though, it has a very fascinating cross-section, which is going to be very difficult to capture on camera. Hopefully some of the close-ups will be able to show us. The main belly is beveled and pinched inward so that this is a long, shallow fuller, which leads to a peak right before the primary bevel, which goes all the way down to the edge of the blade. So this lead gives it both strength and reinforces the tip, as well as making it light. And so it leads to a very, it's a complex design right at the beginning of the steel age, which gives it a very good compromise for both strength over the length of it for thrusting as well as cutting. Let's take a quick look to see how it performs, first in the cut and then in the thrust. Very slightly ragged cut. Interesting that it didn't tear through all the way to the top. Try it again. Try it again. So you can see that even though it's small, it still packs a very good punch. This little sword does fine against light targets, and against heavier targets it might struggle a little bit because, again, it doesn't have a lot of inertia, so it's cut mostly based on speed. It's got a very fine edge. Now this is a sword that's been sent to me for review, and it's gone through many other hands before it's gotten to me. I haven't touched it up myself at all. I can test the edge really very quickly. It still has a bit of an edge even after all the cutting, and again, it's been through many hands before it's... The blade is made of a beautiful pattern welded design that's not too ostentatious and really lovely. With some manufacturers, you do have to be cautious about having a pattern welded blade if you intend to use it for cutting. With LK Chen, the pattern welded blades are still very robust. So if you plan to do very heavy cutting or testing, you might still favor the spring steel option, but the pattern welded designs you don't need to be too cautious with. They still seem to hold up quite nicely. At the time of my recording, this sword is selling for roughly $260 on LK Chen's site, or $270 or so on Cult of Athena. If you're buying it directly from LK Chen, just keep in mind you do have to factor in shipping charges. Depending on where you are in the world, shipping and importing might bring up the cost slightly. So overall, this is a spectacular sword, considering its very inexpensive cost. The faithfulness to the original design is great. The performance is wonderful, and it really showcases how useful even what is kind of a common every soldier's design from 2,000 years ago, exactly what it was. So this is an easy recommendation for anyone who's interested in this type of time period. I glossed over it very quickly, but the thrusting power of the sword is not to be underestimated. If you're going up against heavy targets, you have to be a little bit cautious. It doesn't have a hand stop. Again, if you watched the review done by my friend Scholar General, he tried thrusting it against heavy targets, and you run the risk of these type of swords of your hand riding all the way up the blade. Now, interestingly enough, this tip was able to perform very well. So we'll take a quick second and look at the thrusting performance. So coming back, we can see that it almost was able to have a normalized score of 7 centimeters. So I'm going to start using a new metric by which I grade everything as an A, a B, or a C, depending on how well it was able to thrust. And so this is getting basically like a high B as far as how well it thrusts. This outperformed many of the Xi'an from the later dynasties, and it actually is in the same group as some of the early period Xi'an. So that's kind of surprising, given that it's would be considered by most sword collectors to be considered a kind of hatchet tip design. This is not usually considered a superior type of thrusting design for a single-edged sword. Usually you would bring the tip more inline and round it off to what's called a spear point or a spear tip. So this certainly packs a punch. Let's put this down for a second and bring over the larger example. So this is one of the version 2 models. So this is the improved, if you want to call it, version of the Heavenly Horse Dao, the longer version, which possibly was used for cavalry, possibly wasn't. Just before I put the scabbard away, something you'll notice on the previous example I used, I had the scabbard slide was just adhered strictly to the scabbard. LK Chen has started to reinforce that with this little wrapping, which I think is a good idea. Although the adhesive possibly can hold the scabbard slide directly to the scabbard, which is completely a historical way of doing it. We have every indication that the scabbard slides were just stuck straight onto the scabbard at this point in time. At later points in history, sometimes they had a metal band, which wrapped entirely around the body of the scabbard. Now it's possible through wear and tear and knocking against other things that you can knock them off if they just have glue. And so he's put a little additional rayon cord there to kind of keep it secure. And I think that that's a good idea. Again, very simple designs, nicely finished wood. It's got a very gentle curve to it. Everything's where it should be, and even after passing through all these hands, it's stayed in its place. And compared to the original model, this one now has a more substantial curve over the length of it. So going back to our original definition, if anything, you can see that this curves in the opposite direction of most traditional sabers. And again, historical examples were straight, historical examples were curved slightly this way. In this same time period of the Han Dynasty, and the first couple of centuries after Christ, we can find these ring-pommeled swords in adjacent countries. We can find them in parts of Korea, we can find them in Japan, we can find them, obviously, we discussed the Xiongnu in the Mongolia and the Western Asia. There have been examples from Siberia that do seem to curve in the other direction. Is that indication of the very first sabers anywhere in the world? Perhaps. It's not clear the exact birthplace of the saber. It does seem to be somewhere in Asia, probably with the Turkic nomads, but exactly when and where it proliferated from is still a little bit of a question. So this blade, you can see the curvature perhaps most pronouncedly from that direction. The previous Dao was short and had a very stiff blade. I think it required 20 kilograms of force in order to flex along the length. By comparison, this blade is actually reasonably flexible. It's only maybe 7 kilograms of force in order to flex along the length of it. It's still relatively light for its overall length, coming in at just under 700 grams. Now, just like the Infantry Dao, because it has such little hilt elements, it's carrying a tremendous amount of weight out here. Take a look at the stats really quickly. So after looking at the stats, you can see that it still has a reasonably large amount of maneuverability in the hilt. The low inertia in the hilt combined with very small, very close together pivot points and a lot of weight being carried out in the hilt means that this sword makes it kind of easy to keep the point in line. So if you're trying to point it at someone, that's a little bit easier. The tip doesn't want to wobble around because there's a lot of inertia here at the tip. And you can still wobble the hilt a lot. When LK Chen is demonstrating how to use the sword, he recommends using very powerful sweeping motions to keep the inertia of the blade going. That's certainly possible, and it would make sense if it's being used from chariot back or from horseback. The blade is well made enough and is keen enough that even very small strikes, even metered strikes, will still lead to devastating cuts. Let's watch a little bit of cutting footage. So certainly you can deliver very powerful, very strong strikes with this type of a sword. If you wanted to do just very small strikes with it, um, it can be done, but the proportions of the sword are such that it has such a long blade, it's 94 centimeters, 36 inches, that this is not the sort of sword to use for fencing. It's going to be very hard to strike and recover and block without the weight being proportioned differently. So this is the sort of sword that at best you'll want to have a shield and be able to deliver a big heavy cut and then try and return and protect yourself. And I agree that perhaps it's better to be used from horseback. Now again, I mentioned that we have examples from the historical record and from art that indicate that these were even larger in some cases, and some cases used with two hands. So we don't fully know exactly how they were used. But this particular example, again, for less than $300, it is beautifully made, wonderfully crafted. Let's check the edge even after all that cutting. So even after all that cutting, the edge is still really, really quite sharp. This is a beautiful sword. You can see the pattern in this one perhaps a little bit more sharply than you could in the Infantry Han Dao. And the thrusting power, let's take a quick look at the footage from thrusting. So before it was normalized, the thrusting on this sword was not very impressive because, again, it comes in less than 700 grams of total weight. After it was normalized, this sword outperformed a majority of the Xian that we tested before. So this gets an A in thrusting potential, even though the sword is very flexible in its absolute blade stiffness. I'm very surprised. And again, this would, I think, give credence to what LK Chen suggested, that this is perhaps a horseman's sword, because if you can that easily give point to a target, if you have enough inertia in the blade that you can keep it steady and aim with the tip, and if it's too slow to give a strike and recover for fighting on foot, then it makes perfect sense that this is a sword to be used from horseback. Again, just a very impressive sword, very reasonable for the price. I didn't talk too much about it, but I think that the grip is very handsome. The color is not ostentatious. There's some debate as to how to hold it and retain the ring with your hand. When I first got these, I thought that you'd stick the ring inside of your palm like that. There's been some experimentation with that. I've done some reviewing of the historical art record. In pretty much every case, the artistic depictions indicate that the hand is further up and these ring pommels are exposed. So that will require some work with the martial arts component. But I can heartily endorse both of these swords. They're steals at the cost that LK Chen is currently selling them. So pick yours up right now before the cost increases, and see what was being made 2,000 years ago in Han China. Until next time, guys, take care.